All right, let's bow in. Today is going to be about storytelling. And if you would see, I'll start with sort of a Naropa idea. If you would see the sayings of the Buddha, but you wouldn't know his story, would those sayings touch you the same way? The story that this is a prince doesn't know from death and sickness and poverty, and you hear the story of his life, and he has to find the truth, and he has to find what it's all about once he realizes that things were not as they were presented in the palace. So then as we follow him, we get a sense of that story. And in that story, we hear what this person who lived that life has to share with us. And so stories are wonderful when they are telling us of what people did and how they went. But stories sometimes have other reasons and other meanings. A Yiddish phrase would have it, daughter, I'm talking to you, but I really mean you, daughter-in-law. In other words, you tell a story because you want to make a point. And the story makes the point for you. So instead of having to go into long moral teachings, this man comes to the Rebbe and he says, dear master, I worked so hard to put together our conventicle in our town. And it's a good place. People come there to pray and to study. But everyone there is stepping on me. Is that fair? And the Rebbe says, who asked you to spread yourself all over the place, that wherever one steps on you. And you get to hear in a story like this, so instead of telling anyone off, I would tell him the story. And the point is that he would get the point. There are some stories that take us into other realities. And one way is the way in which Franz Kafka tells a parable about parables. It goes something like this. One man says to the other, stop already with the parables. You always tell me those parables. And what's a parable about? You say, go yonder, transcend yourself. Come on, nobody can go there. Leave me alone with your parables. So the other one says to him, oi, trouble with you is, you never entered into the parable. You never lived the parable. So the parables aren't true for you. I bet you there's also a parable. You win the bet. Do I win that? How do I win this bet? You win the bet in reality. In parable, you lost. You win the bet in reality. In parable, you lost. If you can't go into a parable, then what's the point? One such story is about a rabbi who was in a small town and didn't have any colleagues there. And most of the time people didn't bother him, he didn't bother them. He sat and he studied away. And each time he would make his way to the town to buy another book that he would have another book to study and to add it to his shelves. One day he decides he's going to go to town, and he comes to his usual bookseller who has a book to sell on Kabbalah, and he is now, oh, I want that book. So he asks, how much is it? And it is several weeks' salary, and he doesn't have that money with him. And he decides he's going to go and borrow it from a friend, and only when he has that money he will come back. I'll be right back. Okay. He goes, and by the time he comes back, the man says, "I'm sorry, you weren't here, I sold it, there was someone else here." "To whom did you sell it?" He says, "To the coachman." A coachman, books on Kabbalah, it doesn't fit together. What kind of a story is that? Where does he live? He finds out, he goes, checks him out, and he asks the neighbors about it. He says he reads those storybooks. Kabbalah, that doesn't fit. Now he has lost a book, he gets angry, he feels bitter, he's getting into the carriage again, he doesn't even look who the driver is, he says, "Take me back home to my town." And he takes him along the road, and then he stops at a smithy and has his shoe, the horseshoe replaced, and then he goes on to another place and he buys feed. And the whole trip that should have taken 2 hours is by now it's 6, 7 hours, and he drags them around. They stop in a field and people are harvesting the field, and he says to the rabbi, "Come on, why don't you get out of the car, look around." But he's very angry at this point. He's seething, it's taking so long. What do I need? Smithies and feed stores and stuff like that. And so he's upset. Finally, evening comes and they come to an inn. And they settle for the night at the inn, and the rabbi decides he's going to go and visit one of his colleagues so he can learn to talk with him. And the driver says, "Come on, there are good people here in the inn too." And he is so angry, he feels sort of arrested by the chutzpah of the driver. But he sits down, has himself served a meal, falls asleep. Next morning, he wakes up and he wants to say his prayers first, but the driver says to him, "You'll do your prayers at home. Hop in the wagon, I'll have you there." Half hour later, he has him there. Now the rabbi goes to his wallet and says, "How much do I owe you?" And he says, "You don't owe me a thing. In fact, I'll give you something." Hands him the book that he had bought the day before and says, "If you don't get out of the wagon ever, and you don't meet people, and you don't enjoy the landscape, this book isn't going to help you either." If you can enter that place, that is a full place, what is needed so the book should help him? And that brings us again, because what was happening outside was stories. And what was happening, what he wanted to get to is to the ideas. And if the ideas don't sit in the stories, then the ideas are weak, anemic. How do you always get good stories, they asked this rabbi. Every time you preach, you have a good story, a simile, and it works so good. Where do you get them? How do you do that? He says, "I'll tell you a story." And he says, there was this guy who was a crack shot. He could do so well with his bow and arrow. I mean, he had studied with a Zen archer, I suppose. And this guy is traveling through, it's in Poland, so I don't know how to say. But he's traveling along, and he comes by a barn, and on the barn he sees a whole bunch of bullseyes, and in the very, very center, there is an arrow each. So he's got to meet this guy. He's got to check him out. He's got to see who is a better shot and all that stuff. And he says to the man, "You did this all?" And he says, "Yes." "Are you such an accurate shot?" "No," he says. "First I shoot the arrow, then I draw the bullseye." When the Baal Shem Tov needed to do something special, to work in the highest spheres, he would go to a particular clearing in the forest, and he would bring there different kinds of wood, and he would make a fire there in a special way, and he would make an incantation, and with that shamanic ritual that he did, what he needed to have done was done. In the next generation, it happened that the Maggid of Mezrich didn't know him anymore where the place was in the woods, but he found another clearing and did the same thing, and still it worked. A generation later, he didn't even know what kinds of wood to do, but he did take some wood and found a place, and he didn't even know the incantation, but it still worked. And today is the anniversary of the death of Rabbi Sol Rishona, this Rebbe, of whom it is told that when he, later on in his life, said, I don't know the incantation, I don't know the place, I don't know how to find the wood and how to make the fire, but you know, I can tell the story. And Hasidim say, and the story still helped. And Elie Wiesel uses this tale and asked a question, and he wrote it in French. So he asked the question, why? Why should it help if you just tell the story? And he answers his own question by saying, parce que le bon Dieu aime les histoires. God loves stories. And I think when you get an understanding of this, you realize that the web that in our theology is called the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is made of our stories, all our stories. And as I look right now, we could tell better stories than the stories we are telling. And so it's important to learn something about storytelling so we might up the directions in which the story of our life is going. I could see such a wonderful story for this country, you know, and I'm reading The Nightmare now. So it's really important to learn how to up-level things with the stories we tell. On this subject, where do the stories come from? Nikos Kazantzakis, in his report to Greco, has a story which I think he also heard from Elie Wiesel, and goes something like this. I'm giving it in his language. There was a Rabbi Nachman, and his disciples came to him and said, why can't you teach us like a certain Reb Tzaddik? You always tell stories like a grandmother. No, but behind this you have to hear the Yiddish word Bobbemeises. if you want to say, oh, come on, that's not Bobbemeises, you know? How can you give credit to that? So what happened was that the rose and the thistle had a conversation. And the thistle was saying to the rose, you've got thorns, I've got thorns. You have the same sun, the same soil. How come you make roses and I make thistles? And so it goes that this is the answer that he gave them. And they said, so what does that mean? What does the story mean? So he says, when something occupies me, I think about it, I think about it, I think about it, because the rose says, from the beginning of growth, I've got only one thought, the rose, the rose. You get the sense in which he wants to say that this paradox, this problem that I was working on, will not yield to regular ways of understanding. There are those teachers, like my teacher, the prayer coach, you know. One day I was doing my prayer and making terrible, sad faces, pleading faces. He comes by, he gives me a bang on the side and says, have you already tried with a smile? I tried with a smile, you know. So when such a teacher begins to teach you something and he doesn't want you to make out of that, Fritz Perls used to talk about that there's chicken shit, there's horse shit, and there's elephant shit. And I want to add a category, angel shit. A lot of times people talk about very, very highfalutin spiritual things, and they don't know what they're talking about. So, in order to teach us, we should understand how to look behind what's being presented as concept. They tell us this story. There is a Chassid who is walking on his way to meet his master of Rabbi Zalman, who is the beginner of that chain of transmission that comes to me. So he is on his way, and Hasidim, when they do their pilgrimage, they'd rather walk than take a ride, because on the way there's so much that you work through, how you prepare yourself to meet your master, and you look over where you are in life, and so on and so forth. So he's walking along. In the meantime, a carriage comes along on that road, and sort of pulls up next to him, and there's a man knocking on the window of the door, calls him over, and inside sits a very well-dressed dandy, a Jewish dandy. And he says to this young man, he says, "Where are you going to?" He says, "To Yoshina, to see my master." "Oh, what coincidence. I'm also traveling to see him there. Why don't you come and share the ride with me?" And the guy comes in, he figures, what is this guy doing with my master? So he tells him, "You see, my grandfather was a Kabbalist up to here. My father, a Kabbalist, only up to here. I'm only up to here, but this up to here is also quite profound. And I heard that your master, your teacher, is a Kabbalist, so I'm going to go and test him." When our chassid, the devotee, hears this thing, this megeg is going to go and test him. He proposes a test, and he says like this, "Sir, you, a Kabbalist up to here, the son of a Kabbalist up to here, grandson of a Kabbalist up to here, you must know so much Kabbalah. Let me tell you, as I was passing through this little town, I looked in a book, and in that book was the following statement. If I could do it in Hebrew, it would sound even better. In the beginning, it was all separated and sundered. A force brought it all together into a great orb, and lines appeared, crisscrossing and creating fields. And in the very center of the field, there was a point. And through the collaboration of the angel of fire and the angel of water, it all came out well." He says, "Wait a minute, let me see." He runs his browser on his hard drive, can't find it in the Zohar, can't find it in the Midrash, can't find it in Luria, he can't find it in Cordovero. He's puzzled. He says, "You know, young man, I'm going to ask him this question as the first question. Let's see if he knows." Good, he's very happy. He knows this dandy is going to go and see the Rebbe way before I go and see him. So, good. So he comes in, and he says, on the way here, I met this young man, and he proposed this question in ancient text. "Would you please know where it's from and what it means?" And he repeats to him, "In the beginning it was all," etc., etc. When the Rebbe closes his eyes, he says, "It's ravioli." In the beginning it was all separated, and suddenly it was flour. In a force it came together, in an orb it was rolled up. Lines appeared and crisscrossed. And in the very center of the field you put a point, a little bit of meat. And put it together through the agency of the angel of fire, the angel of water. It came out good. You understand why he is asking, why he's telling us this story? What does he want to teach us with it? He wants to say, don't get hullabalooed by jargon. That's what he's saying. Because you get to the place and you say, now I understand that this has to have a referent, that all spiritual things have to have a reference. If you're going to say Nirmanakaya and just going to use those words, it won't have a reference for you unless you can touch it in experience. So that's the wonderful part of such a teaching tale. It reminds you that you don't let yourself be snowed. There are a whole number of beautiful Hasidic tales that are there for inspiration, for modeling, how would I say, ultra-virtuous behavior. My friend Reb Shlomo Karlebach, I used to call him the genius of virtuous reality. Because when he told you a story, the story took you to that place where a certain virtue was lived out. So here's a story. In the town of Tulchin, where the Rebbe Reb Baruch lives, there has been a drought. And I'm telling the story, you're here, so we shouldn't have a drought. Okay. So there was this drought, and the question was, what can they do? They had fasted, they had prayed, they had come to the rabbi and asked him, do you have any good word? And finally he says, I can't help you. So they said, so what are we going to do? And he says, I tell you what. If you go to such and such a town, not too far from here, you will find a drunk on a bench in an inn. There will be a bottle next to him. And when he comes out from his stupor, he's going to reach for the bottle. And you must not let him drink from the bottle until after he has given you a blessing that the drought will stop and rain will come where it is needed. Well, what can you do? You need the rain, so they go. They can't understand how is a drunkard going to be able to do that and stuff like that. They don't get it. But sure enough, they find him where the Rebbe said they would find him. And he is reaching for the bottle, and they grab his hand, take the bottle away from him, and he gets nasty with him. I want my bottle. Finally, he gets clear enough so that he understands what they're asking of him. And he wants the bottle so bad that he speaks out right away. Okay, I wish you should have all the rain that you need, that you want, it should be good for you and so on. Not let me have the bottle. And sure enough, by the time they come home from that village, the rain begins and everything's good. Now they're puzzled. What's this got to do with this drunk should have such power that even the Rebbe himself didn't have such power, and the drunk should have? How could that be? It doesn't make any sense. So finally they corner the Rebbe and they say, you must tell us the story, and he tells. In the town where you met him, there were several guys who would brag all about their sexual adventures that they were having with peasant girls in the neighborhood. And then one day, this guy who was hanging out with them was doing his bragging, and they said, come on, what do you really know from this kind of stuff? In St. Petersburg, there's a courtesan who takes 300 rubles for the night. Now, that's what I call an experience. So the poor guy does work very hard, saves penny by penny, finally has together 300 rubles, and his friends say, and what about wining and dining in a hotel? You gotta have 100 more rubles. He's got the money together, he is on his way, and he isn't traveling fast, so that he should be able to save money and get there. When he comes on the scene in a small town, a woman dressed in a bridal dress is crying, people are standing next to her, people are standing in a circle and arguing and nearly coming to fisticuffs, and the guy says, what's going on here? And they tell him, this girl was supposed to be married now, and her father did not have the dowry money that he was to give. And so they don't want to go to the wedding. Like, he sees the people crying, fighting, all this is going on for them. It's not happy. And his heart is touched so much by that he finds out how much it is, exactly the money that he has, gives it to the bridegroom so the wedding could proceed, and then starts on his way home. In heaven, and that's always a very important part, in heaven that deed was seen as such a remarkable thing that a person should, for the sake of his lust, take penny by penny and save this up and then give this away to help somebody in such a wonderful way. So they decided in heaven that he is to have powers to give blessings. So Satan came around and said, if this guy is going to have all the power to give blessings, I'm going to be out of business. So they said to him, look, we do what we have to do, you do what you have to do. And Satan made him a drunk. And you hear a story like this, and you get a sense of times in which, in your mind, there's a sort of a quick checking back. Was I ever in a situation where I could have helped at a sacrifice to myself and didn't, you know? So that's the point of these stories that speak of virtue and want to bring you to that place. What was so wonderful about how my friend Rabbi Shlomo told stories was he never told them like they were in the book. I read the same books where you get the stories from. But he never told them the way in which they were in the book. And I finally got to understand what he was doing. After he had read The Treatment, he made a whole movie in his head about it. And when he was talking about it, he could tell it with the furniture that was there. Do you know what I mean? With every part of, because he had visualized it and to some extent experienced it. And that part where he experiences it and tells the story of a great offering, a great sacrifice like this, and there is something in the heart that gives a little shiver, you know, and touches us. And these things that touch us in this way are really a lot of what the stories that the Hasidim tell. Tell you another one. The penitential season comes around, and every morning people get up before dawn, go to the synagogue and recite the prayers in which they tell how sorry they are for the things that they have done that they shouldn't have done, and so on and so forth. They call on God's mercy, and they chant a very powerful mantra, Adonai, Adonai, Elachum v'Chanun. And so the question is, everybody's in the synagogue, but the rabbi isn't there. So when a guy who was a Lithuanian, and Lithuanians in our Yiddish lingo are from Missouri. You know, they want to be shown. So this guy says, where's the Rebbe? And they say, he's in heaven. At this time of the year, he goes up to heaven and does what he has to do right there in heaven. That Litvak, that night, he decides he's going to stay up, and he hangs out in front of the house of the Rebbe. It's pretty cold, but he had his fur on. And the Rebbe is making his way out of the house, but he doesn't look like a Rebbe. He looks like a Polish peasant. You know, in Europe, it was very, very clear who you are, what kind of work you did, by the clothes you wore. So he looks like a Polish peasant. a big rope tied around his belt, and as a belt, and a hatchet. So he walks behind him to see what he's doing. He goes into the woods.
Your mic is off.
Is the mic off?
Yeah.
The mic is off.
Maybe you push the button. Push the button.
I'll wait a little bit.
Try the button.
Try the button.
No. Aha. Yes. Well, one of the considerations for our vice president might be that and for you, might be that the audio system there is better.
Yes.
All right. I'm in the middle of the story. Where was I? Yes, he is. And he is walking into the forest, and he is picking up fallen wood and chops it into certain lengths, takes the rope, ties it around, puts it on his shoulder, and trudges his way back to town through the snow. Behind him is the Litvak. He wants to see where the Rebbe is going. And so he makes his way, and he sees he's walking in to a narrow alley. At the end of that alley, a broken shack. He bangs on the door. A voice comes out, "Who is there?" And he says, "Wojciech," Polish peasant's name. And the voice says, "What do you want?" He says, "I've come to bring you wood." She says, "Wojciech, I don't have any money to pay you." And Wojciech says, "You have a great God, you'll pay me. But I can't even get out of bed, I'm sick, I can't make the fire. If you don't mind, I'll come and make you a fire too." And he goes in, and the Litvak is standing at the door watching this whole business, and he sees as the Rebbe builds the fire and puts each log on there to make the fire, he recites the prayers. Next day, he's in the synagogue, and people are saying, "No, where's the Rebbe?" And somebody says, "The Rebbe is in heaven." And the Litvak says, "If not higher." Isn't that remarkable? Like this, what this does, go again, the moment the aha of that comes, it touches the heart. And that's basically what those stories need to convey. There's a Zen story. Are we on again? Off again? On again. Very good. It will need adjusting, Jay. All right, so here we go. Zen story. The patriarch wants very much to see the sutras printed. And in order to print the sutras, you have to have wood blocks, and in Chinese, and you have to carve them in mirror writing, so that they should print right. And you can imagine it costs money. And he felt this was so important that he went around, left the monastery, and went begging to get the money together to be able to to have these blocks made and to print the sutras. He now has the whole amount together, and there is a flood. And so he goes and helps the victims of the flood with the money. He goes again to collect. And again, he gets the money together. And he has it now, there's an earthquake, and the victims need help. I'm thinking right now, whatever merit we can send, we should send to people in Southern California so that the fire might abate there. And so he was helping those victims, and then he goes and collects again. And by the third time, he managed to print the sutras. But those who know say that the first two editions were higher than the third. Do you see that? It is so wonderful that in each tradition you find a way in which you tell this story. And so there are so many wonderful Zen stories. There are stories that speak about a test of sincerity. And I'll tell you two stories, and one is a Zen story. A man comes to Rabbi Melech of Lizhensk, and he is heartbroken. He has seen the light. He realizes how many terrible sins he has committed, and he wants to go and atone for them. And he comes to the Rebbe and details the sins that he had committed, and they're very heavy ones. And according to the rules, some of these even demand capital punishment. So the Rebbe says to him, if you truly want to repent and be forgiven, I'll have to execute you. All right, he says, I'm willing to do that as long as I can get back in God's good graces. Because there you spend an eternity and you don't want it to be in the wrong place. So he was ready to go and to be put to death. But the Rebbe says, hey, not so fast, you know, there's a lot of homework you have to do to get ready for that. And he takes him through all kinds of penance, and the guy is really transformed now into another person. And the day has arrived of the execution, and he is seated in a bench, tied down, and there is a pot of lead being heated to be made liquid, because that was a form of execution. You pour hot lead down the throat of a person.
Hey.
That's a deterrent. So, this guy, the story isn't over. So this guy is there, he opens his mouth, confesses his sins again, says Shema Yisrael, the last words before dying, and as he opens his mouth, and Rabbi Melech takes the ladle and dips it into honey and pours it into his mouth. The guy begins to sputter and to say, what do you do that for? I was ready to die. And the Rebbe says, at this point you didn't need to anymore. So, another story. A young guy has heard about Zen monasteries, and they're supposed to get you enlightened quick, and so he decided not to go to Soto, but to go to Rinzai, where you get it really quick. And he arrives at the monastery and talks to the Roshi and says to the Roshi like this, look, I don't have a lot of patience. You know? I'm willing to do it. I'm prepared to do it. He was a son of a merchant, a rich merchant, and he didn't have to do a stitch of work in his life. And so the Roshi looks at him. He says, is there anything that you can do? He said, well, the story as I read it was chess, but it really was Go. Yeah. I've learned how to play Go. Are you good? Pretty good. All right, I'll test you out. And he calls a monk, and he asks the monk, who is the best Go player in that monastery, to play this young man. And he takes a sword and holds it by his side and says, I'm going to watch you play. And the one who loses his head. The young man, so rattled by that challenge, doesn't know what he's going to do about that. He doesn't make some good moves in the beginning. But it's his head, and his head clears, and he takes advantage of some of the things that he sees, and so finally he is now gaining on the monk. And a couple of more moves and he will have the monk beaten. And he looks at the monk and makes a bad move or two. And the Roshi takes the sword and whacks down on the Go board and says, I'll take you on. Two things are needed for Zen: intense concentration and compassion, and we've shown both. Yeah, these are stories, that bring tears to your eyes because they touch the heart. We have some great reincarnation stories. I'll tell you a short one. A man about 55 comes to the Baal Shem Tov and says, I have such a terrible life. I need some help. I'm so poor. Please. And I'm not even healthy. So help me. Show me what can be done for me. And the Baal Shem Tov said, well, I'll tell you the name of somebody, and you go and find that person, and the person lives in the city of Brod. So you go there and meet this person. I'm going to give him a name X and Y, because if I start giving you Hebrew names, it's going to get confusing. So go to X, find X and Y in Brod, and say that I sent you, he can help you. Well, the big synagogue where the rich guys daven, it should be the place where the guy who can help me is. But he goes to another synagogue. Everywhere he goes, he asks and they tell him the same story, they don't know him. Now he is heartbroken. He goes out to the cemetery. And at the cemetery he cries his heart out. And there is the beadle of the cemetery coming up to him and says, an old man, he says, "No, what are you crying for? What's the matter with you?" And he pours out the whole story. And I went to look for X and Y. He says, X and Y? Come, I'll show you where X and Y is. Takes him to the edge of the cemetery, where you bury all the bad guys, and shows him a grave, and sure enough, it had the name of that person on it. So now he is really angry at the Baal Shem Tov. What he sent me here for? Comes back, confronts the Rebbe, and says, what was that all about? He says, how old are you? He's 55. When did this guy die? 60. What was his reputation? That even if I would have come to him while he was alive, he wouldn't have helped me. He was a really nasty guy. And as the Baal Shem Tov stands and looks at him, and the guy says, you mean? Because we do believe in reincarnation. You mean that this guy was me last time around? And so yes, the Baal Shem Tov said yes. Any complaints? Do you understand? He's showing him that the karma that he is experiencing is what he was responsible for. When I tell this story, I ask myself this question: what would it look like when we come back 60 years from now, or more, and we look around and see what has happened to our planet, and we'll want to blame somebody? It's just us. Just us. And so when you hear a story, the story takes you to such a place. There is a conundrum in every religious tradition that goes like this. If human beings have free will, then there couldn't be anything like divine providence, determination. If, on the other hand, everything is determined, and there are many scriptures that say that too, then where are we with the freedom of will? And so they come to the Rebbe and they ask him, how do we deal with that thing? And so the Rebbe says, again, would someone go and call me Yvonne the fisherman? And so they call him. And he says, you have a skiff with which you go out. Would you take us for a ride? And do you think you can load it on a wagon? Yes, with the help of some people I can load it on a wagon. So they load the skiff on the wagon, they take it down to a wonderful calm lake. And at this calm lake, the Rebbe and some of his followers go into the skiff, and he gives them each an oar, and he says, row. You want to row to the right, row to the right. You want to row to the left, row to the left. And they see they can row wherever they want. Enough, he says, let's go back. They load the skiff, and he asks, Ivan, would you take us down the waterfall? And he says, are you crazy? You couldn't pay me any money, I should take you down. You're all going to be killed. He says, okay, then take us down to the Bialchik. The Bialchik is a river that goes into the Bug, which is a large river in Poland. Take us down to the Bialchik. He says, what do you want to do at the Bialchik? I want you to take us down the whitewater there. He says, when I was a kid, I used to do that with my friends. I don't do this anymore. He says, well, for this time, we're going to pay you well. He says, well, then you all will have to row as I tell you. And they go down to the Bialchik, get into the thing, and here's a boulder coming, quick to the right, push, and against the stream, and this and that. By the time they get there, they have lost the energy, the strength. And then they say, what was this all about? They help them back with the boat and come and sit with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, they say, why did you take us there? He said, because the people who say that you have the freedom of choice are talking about Lake Placid. The people who are saying everything is determined are talking about the waterfall. But life is the Bialchik. So, these are stories. I want to read you one story, though. There is this Rebbe, and since I write the story, this is my story, who one day has a dream. And he comes to his disciples, to his community, because we have such a thing as a dream, an amelioration of a dream. You tell the dream and people help you interpret it and get to the meaning of it and so on. And there's a whole section of the prayer book that deals with that. So what was the dream? And the dream was that I found myself in a cave. And in that cave there was a big hall. And in that hall there were a series of books by the years, or by epochs, by times. And it said how to be a tzaddik in 200 BC. How to be a tzaddik in 500 AD. How to be a tzaddik in this year, how to be a tzaddik in that year. And everywhere I looked into the books, there was such great, deep teachings about transformation that form the legacy that comes through our chain of transmission. But I needed to find out how to be a tzaddik in our day. And I looked, and finally I found at the end of, here we are again, good. At the end of the shelves, there was a book that had this time, and it had my name on. And I pulled out the book, and the pages were blank. And so, I ask you, dream interpreters, I ask people, interpret that for me. How will I be able to do what I need to do this time around? And they went back and forth. One suggested one should take a digest of all the other books from before, that would be a good beginning. And somebody else said, no, that won't help because the conditions have changed. And so as they're arguing back and forth, They can't come to a conclusion. They say that thing. What we get is that this book is the book that you have to write. And if you are worried about whether you'll be able to finish it, this much we can say. You will have written even the last word in this book before your time comes. It's the kind of a dream story, you know, in which a person looks at his life and says, what is it all about?